In the early ages of Arda, the fallen Valar Melkor would flee to Middle-earth and begin his dark schemes to conquer the realms of the world, where Eru Ilúvatar, the One, had the power to create. Melkor would only be able to take that which already was to twist and corrupt to his own designs. The most well-known of these designs are called orcs. Melkor would take the first children of Ilúvatar, the elves, and eventually turn them into the horrid creatures we are familiar with today. Deep within Melkor's fortress of Angband, the orcs would multiply until the time came for them to be released upon the world. There, alongside other well-known atrocities amongst Melkor's hosts, such as the Balrogs and dragons, would cause chaos and destruction across the free lands of Middle-earth until Melkor's eventual downfall at the end of the First Age. The Second Age would reveal a new Dark Lord, Sauron, Melkor's chief lieutenant, who would succeed his old master and take control of what remained of his scattered forces. These orcs would again multiply and serve their new lord, terrorizing the free people of the world for several thousand years, until the most unlikely creature imaginable would take on a quest that would change the fate of the world forever. Today we are painting something very special. The original 2001 release of the metal Mordor Orcs sculpted by Alan and Michael Perry. I picked up these a few months back when Games Workshop did a special made to order for these and a few other discontinued models. Amongst these I picked up the box of Mordor Orcs, the blister pack of the 4 Orc Bowmen, and the 2 Orc Captains that were from a later release. I always wanted these orcs back in the day, and due to them being metal and only available in packs of 3 in the old blisters, they were just too cost prohibitive for a young teenage me at the time, so I'm really excited to get the chance to paint these up today. So with these being all brand new metal models, they needed a lot of cleanup, so I began removing the flashing and those little metal noodles hanging off them, then filed down any mold lines I could see. Once they were all cleaned up and prepped, I then primed them all in black. I started with painting all the armor parts on them first, using Tinny Tin from Vallejo, base coating all the armor plates, scale mail and chain mail, with the only exception being the Orc Captain wearing the Gondorian armor, which will be done in a silver color a bit later. Once the tin base coat was dry, I then applied Citadel's Black Legion contrast paint over all the armor, darkening it so that it was just a slight tint of the tin still visible. Next I moved on to all the fabric and leather parts of these orcs. Now as I'm painting 20 together, I won't name each paint I'm using, so I'll just show them here. But basically it's just a lot of different shades of browns, tans, khakis, with some dark greys and reds thrown in. Orcs aren't uniform like most armies, at least not like the Uruk-hai or Morannon orcs you see in the films, so I kept it all pretty random with what colours we used where, not thinking too much about it, keeping it all within similar tones for the most part, with a little variation here and there. After I finished base coating the fabric and leathers, I then applied a base of gunmetal to the Orc Captain's armor, which seems to be loosely based off this guy here, wearing some scavenged Gondorian armor looted off some poor bugger in Osgiliath, with some extra severed heads tied on for that extra flair. I kept all the gunmetal to the breastplate and greaves, but painted the Orcish helm and shoulder plates up like the rest of the orcs. Moving back onto the rest of the orcs, I then went over all the wooden sections with Rhinox hide, painting all the spears, arrow shafts, bows and wooden shields. I then did some highlights in lighter shades of brown, in my case chestnut brown, then onto Mournfang brown. Highlighting the panels on the shield with these colours was done using fine vertical strokes, trying to simulate a wood grain effect. Next up, it was time to really dirty these guys up with some washes. Taking out my Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, I started to slap it on all over them. Using Agrax Earth on all of the cloth and leather sections, even on the reds, to really give it a dirty, toned down shade. For the grey fabrics, I used Nuln Oil to darken it down even further. Once all the washes were dry, I then highlighted over all the clothing with the original base colours used, giving us a mid-tone highlight and leaving the darker washed areas as our shadows. I then finished with some edge highlights using a lighter colour, either using a lighter shade paint than the one under it, or mixing a little bone colour in depending on what I had available. Now it's time to move on to the skin, and again, there's no real specific uniform colour to do these in, so I chose a selection of paints I thought would reflect some orc flesh tones and began to base coat all the exposed areas of the skin. Some were a very pinky flesh colour, some were more yellow, and some were darkish grey, with some others being more of a greyish green. Once dry, I then cracked open the old Agrax Earthshade pot again and started applying it to all the orc skin, letting it pull into the creases, especially around the eyes and any other detailed areas, and toning down the brightness of the base colours a bit too. Next, I repeated the process like I did with the clothing and went in to highlight the skin once the washes were dry with the original base colours, then working it up to gradual lighter highlights. Here is where you can really start seeing these models coming together. Once I was done with the highlighting, it was time to work on the eyes. I decided to go with a couple of different eye colours as there's some variation you can see in the movies. For the first colour I went with Vallejo's Filthy Brown, which is more of an icky yellow, and carefully dotted the eyes with a fine brush. Then for the second eye colour, I used Vallejo Flat Red and applied that onto the rest of the models. And then took my fine tipped marker and dotted in the pupils. Keeping on with the face detailing, I then took some bone white paint and carefully picked out any models showing their teeth. I then gave the teeth a wash of Agrax Earthshade to take the edge off the brightness. Next up was to paint the hair. Some orcs received a base of dark grey, eventually bringing up the highlights with lighter greys. And for some of the other orcs, I went with a dark brown base working up to lighter shades for the highlights. While I had the browns out, I used this opportunity to do the fur pelts on any of the orcs with them too, painting them up pretty much the same way, but doing some darker patches and lighter patches to vary it up. Now it was time to get back into detailing the armor we started at the beginning. I took out the tinny tin again and started to highlight the armor parts, doing careful controlled dry brushes on the scale and chainmail and edge highlighting random parts of the plate armor. I also picked out any details on the metal sections of the shields, weapons and belt buckles. For the second highlight, I used gunmetal, but used it more sparingly to show where the dirty, rusty, caked up armor would have been chipped back, revealing the metal underneath. Now back onto the captain. I'd given the armor a wash of Nuln Oil and now followed it up with the gunmetal to highlight back up the plate armor, picking out the raised details on the tree and the tops of the curved sections, as well as the edges. I then did a final highlight with Vallejo Chainmail Silver. Getting into the fun, gory stuff, I began painting up the severed heads now, starting with some pale flesh tones on both heads. Then I painted the hair, going for blonde on the front head and brown hair for the back. Doing the usual highlighting with lighter tones to each highlight. I then gave the heads a sepia wash before going back over the highlights with the base color. I then did a final highlight with an even lighter shade of flesh, trying to get a pale, dead tone look to the skin. I then carefully painted in the cold, dead, wide open eyes on both faces before moving on to the bloody bits. I took out a pot of blood for the Blood God, a very cool blood effect paint from Citadel, which really does look like some nice, thick, sticky blood, and I used it to bloody up the orc. I first applied some to the severed necks of the heads, then to really make this captain stand out even more, I applied it to some of the armor. The film orc this is inspired by has a splattering of blood across the breastplate, so I did the same on the model, trying not to go overboard, as it was tempting to just go all out with it, as the effect looks so cool. I then did a little extra blood on the severed heads where they might have been battered around a bit, and ran a little bit along the sword as well for good measure. I then just finished up some last little details, like the knots tying the heads to the belts and finishing up any last minute highlights before moving on to the basing. As per usual, I did the bases in Rhinoxide. I could have just gone with painting the rims, but I like doing the whole base for some reason, even though the tops won't be seen after the next step. So for the actual basing, I had 20 orcs to base and I just wanted to see them finished at this point, so I decided to use super glue instead of PVA or a basing glue, so that it would bond to my basing material instantly and I wouldn't have to wait forever for it to dry, trying not to stick it to everything. Then I got a toothpick and I spread the glue to all the tighter parts under the model to cover the whole base. I then took out some base-ready Grimdark City rubble from Geek Gaming Scenics and dipped the bases into it, shaking off the excess. I went with this for the bases as I wanted to replicate the harsh terrain of Mordor, imagining these as orcs fighting the last alliance on the plateau of Gorgoroth. I repeated this step for all the orcs except the captain in the Minas Tirith armor, who as more of a Third Age style orc I wanted to do something a little more appropriate. This is an orc who has fought in the ruins of Osgiliath, so I mixed some of the grimdark city rubble from before with the much lighter city rubble base ready material. Once I felt I had a good mix of the two, I then applied glue to the captain's base and dunked it in the mixture. I then took some select larger pieces of rock that could pass as chunks of ruined stone and individually glued it to parts of the base. To finish these all off, I then took a variety of static grass tufts in a dry or burnt colour and applied them at random to the bases. For the captain only, I used some small 2mm green tufts as well. So now we're finally done, and it's time to show off. Sorry about it being a while since the last video. The intention when I started this one was to get in on the whole painting orcs for Orktober thing that people on the tube like to do every year, but as we're almost through November now, you could say I'm a little late. Regardless, I'm glad I got these done and I'm pretty happy with how they look. I can't wait to show you all what I paint up next, so I'll see you in the next one.